there's a question few people dare to ask themselves. What if what you call coincidence isn't coincidence at all? What if the strange events that arise in your life aren't errors of reality, but signs that something within you is awakening? Carl Jung spent decades investigating precisely this mystery, and the more he studied the human mind, the more he realized that there are experiences that defy any simple explanation. Experiences that often arise when a person begins to undergo a profound psychological transformation. Perhaps you've experienced something similar. You think intensely about someone you haven't seen in years, and a few hours later, that person gets in touch. You're searching for answers to a problem, and unexpectedly, you find exactly the message you needed to hear. A book appears at the right moment. A phrase catches your attention in an unusual way. A seemingly casual encounter completely changes the course of your life. Most people ignore these events or call them luck. But Jung saw something very different. For him, the human mind is not isolated from the rest of reality. There is a profound connection between the inner world and the outer world. A connection so subtle that it goes unnoticed by almost everyone. However, as consciousness begins to awaken, this link becomes increasingly evident. The problem is that this process usually begins silently. There's no siren announcing that your perception is shifting. There's no official moment when someone declares you've entered a new phase of consciousness. Instead, small cracks begin to appear in how you used to see reality. Things that once seemed obvious cease to make sense. Explanations that were once sufficient begin to seem superficial, and questions that never mattered begin to occupy your thoughts. Jung observed this pattern numerous times in his patients. People who arrived at his office believing they were losing control, when in reality, they were beginning a profound encounter with themselves. Imagine living for years believing that reality works only through cause and effect. You study, work, make choices, and receive results. Everything seems predictable. Everything seems mechanical. Then, without warning, events begin to occur that don't fit this model. Events that seem laden with meaning. Patterns that appear repeatedly. Coincidences so improbable that they defy any rational calculation. The first reaction is usually doubt. Am I imagining things? Am I seeing meaning where there is none? Could all of this just be a figment of my imagination? These questions are natural. In fact, Jung believed they are an important part of the process. After all, a mature consciousness does not accept any experience without reflection. It questions, it investigates, it seeks to understand. But there comes a point when the number of experiences becomes too great to ignore. You start to realize that certain events seem to occur exactly when you need them, as if something invisible were orchestrating encounters, information, and opportunities in a way that's impossible to fully explain. It was to describe this phenomenon that Jung created one of the most fascinating concepts in all of psychology: synchronicity. Unlike ordinary coincidence, synchronicity doesn't depend on a cause and effect relationship. It depends on meaning. Two seemingly unconnected events appear united by a profound sense of meaning. And the more aware a person becomes, the more these events seem to multiply. This doesn't mean the universe is sending literal messages, or that there's a magical force controlling everything. Jung was too careful to make simplistic claims. What he observed was something far more interesting. He realized that the human psyche possesses an extraordinary capacity to recognize meaningful patterns when it comes into contact with deeper layers of its own consciousness. In other words, perhaps reality isn't changing. Perhaps you are the one beginning to see what has always been there. Think about it for a moment. How many times have you followed a path simply because it was expected? How many times have you ignored an intuition because it seemed irrational? How many times have you silenced an inner feeling to continue fitting into what others considered normal? Jung believed that most people spend their entire lives distant from themselves, not because they want to, but because they have been trained from an early age to look only outward, to seek answers in external opinions, rules, expectations, and validation. Awakening begins when this dynamic is reversed. For the first time, the person begins to pay attention to what is happening inside them. And that changes everything, because the inner world has its own language, a language made of symbols, images, dreams, emotions, and perceptions that cannot always be translated into pure logic. It is precisely at this point that many people begin to feel isolated. How do you explain an experience to someone that cannot be measured? How can you describe a profound sense of meaning without sounding exaggerated? How do you talk about transformative coincidences to people who see everything as mere chance? This is one of the difficulties that Jung repeatedly identified. The more aware a person becomes, the more they realize that certain experiences are impossible to fully convey through words, not because they are fantasies, but because they belong to a dimension of human experience that needs to be lived in order to be understood. Perhaps you've felt this before. Perhaps there are moments in your life that you've never told anyone about. Moments that change the way you see the world. Moments that seem to carry a truth impossible to explain. And perhaps the reason these experiences keep returning to your memory is because they are trying to show you something you haven't fully understood yet. Carl Jung believed that consciousness has a natural tendency toward growth, a silent yet powerful tendency. And when this growth begins, reality seems to acquire new layers of meaning. The curious thing is that synchronicities are not the deepest stage of this process. In reality, they are only the surface. They are the first signs that something much bigger is happening in the depths of the psyche, because an even more surprising transformation awaits those who continue to advance on this path, a change that alters the very structure of the mind and allows one to see reality in a completely different way. And it was precisely this discovery that led Carl Jung to develop one of the most revolutionary ideas in all his work, a psychological capacity so rare that, when awakened, it makes it impossible to think as before. There is a moment in the awakening process that Carl Jung considered a true psychological breaking point, not because something breaks inside you, but because something expands. And when that expansion happens, the way you saw life begins to seem too small to contain what you now perceive. Most people live within a mental framework based on absolute choices, right or wrong, strong or weak, victory or defeat, light or darkness. From an early age, we are taught to organize reality through these divisions. This creates a sense of order that makes the world seem comprehensible. But Jung discovered that there is a stage in psychological evolution where this way of thinking begins to become insufficient, and it is precisely at this moment that what he called the Transcendent Function emerges. The name may sound complex, but the experience is profoundly human. Imagine a person who has lost someone they loved deeply. For a long time, they believed they must choose between two interpretations. Either the loss was simply an unfair tragedy, or it brought some important lesson. But then, at a certain point, they realize something unexpected. Both things are true at the same time. The pain persists. The longing continues to exist. But there is also growth. Transformation also exists. There is also meaning. And for the first time, she doesn't feel the need to choose just one of those truths. For Jung, this is one of the first signs of a maturing consciousness. The mind ceases to function as a court that needs to declare winners and losers. It becomes a space capable of accommodating contradictions without collapsing. This sounds simple when we hear the explanation, but in practice it completely changes the way someone lives. Think about how many times you suffered because you believed you needed to find a definitive answer for everything. You love someone, but you also notice flaws in that person. You feel fear, but at the same time you know you need to move forward. You want security, but you also want freedom. The ordinary mind tries to eliminate one of these forces. Expanding consciousness learns to coexist with both. Jung observed that profoundly transformed people develop a rare ability. They are able to remain present within the complexity, without rushing to simplistic solutions. While most people seek quick answers, they learn to stay with the questions. And this completely changes the quality of perception. Perhaps you've already experienced a similar situation. Someone does something that deeply disappoints you, Their first reaction is to label him as a bad person. But as time goes by, you begin to see your pain, your limitations, your fears, and your history. Suddenly, the situation ceases to be simple. You keep acknowledging the mistake, but he also recognizes the humanity behind it. This is exactly the direction Jung was pointing. Not a consciousness that ignores the problems, but a consciousness that can see through layers that were previously hidden. The curious thing is that this process doesn't only happen in romantic relationships. It begins to appear in all areas of life. A person can look at their past and realize something they never noticed before. The most difficult moments of his journey were not just periods of suffering. These were also periods of growth. The biggest rejections weren't just losses. These were redirections. The failures were not just failures. These were forces that pushed her toward a more authentic version of herself. This change in perspective doesn't happen because the person is trying to be positive. Jung did not advocate superficial optimism. In fact, he strongly criticized any attempt to deny pain. For him, true growth happens when we are able to look at the whole of reality, including its most difficult parts, including its shadow. Perhaps that's why so many people avoid this process, because seeing only the light is comfortable. Seeing only darkness can also be comfortable. The challenge lies in sustaining both things at the same time. This is where one of the greatest internal conflicts of awakening arises. You begin to realize that many of the certainties that underpinned your identity were incomplete. What once seemed absolutely true begins to reveal nuances. Rigid opinions are beginning to lose their power. Old beliefs are being questioned, and this can create an uncomfortable feeling. For a few moments, it feels like you no longer know exactly where you stand. But Jung believed that this temporary confusion is a positive sign. It indicates that the psyche is leaving behind old structures to build something broader. It's like leaving a small house and entering a much larger space. For a while, everything seems disorganized, but little by little, a new order begins to emerge, and along with it comes something even more fascinating: spontaneous wisdom. Many people report that, after going through this stage, they begin to receive unexpected insights. Problems that seemed unsolvable suddenly find solutions. Ideas emerge fully formed. Understanding emerges effortlessly. It's as if a silent intelligence were collaborating with the conscious mind. Jung believed that this happens when the unconscious ceases to be an unknown enemy and begins to become a creative partner. Instead of fighting against the depths of their own psyche, the person learns to listen to them. And the more you learn to listen, the more you realize something surprising. Life is rarely as simple as it seems. Behind every conflict lies a hidden layer. Behind every emotion lies a message. Behind every difficulty lies a possibility for transformation. But this new way of seeing reality creates another challenge. You start to feel different from the conversations around you. Discussions that once seemed important become superficial. Fights that mobilize crowds begin to seem like oversimplifications. While many people try to decide who is right and who is wrong, you begin to realize that almost everyone carries a part of the truth and a part of illusion. This can lead to isolation, because society often rewards those who choose sides. But expanding awareness begins to see the whole picture, and there isn't always room for that. Carl Jung lived with this conflict throughout his entire life. Many of his ideas were misunderstood, precisely because he refused to reduce complex phenomena to simple explanations. He preferred to remain surrounded by mystery. I preferred to investigate rather than draw quick conclusions. I preferred to broaden questions rather than offer easy answers. And perhaps that's exactly what's happening to you right now. Perhaps life is trying to show that reality is much bigger than it seemed. Perhaps you are learning to see beyond the divisions that previously organized your world. Perhaps you are discovering that psychological maturity does not consist of eliminating opposites, but in integrating them. And when this integration begins to happen, an even more extraordinary door opens. Because there is a place where this collaboration between the conscious and unconscious manifests itself in a much more intense way. A place that Carl Jung considered one of the most important ways to access the profound wisdom of the soul. And every night, Without exception, you go inside, even if you haven't realized it yet. The world of dreams is about to reveal something that could completely change your understanding of who you really are. Have you ever woken up with the feeling that you were somewhere real during the night? Not just dreaming, but living something that felt more real than many everyday life experiences? Carl Jung spent much of his career trying to understand this phenomenon. And the more he investigated dreams, the more he arrived at a conclusion that was uncomfortable for the traditional view of the human mind. Perhaps dreams are not just random products of the brain. Perhaps they are one of the main ways in which the psyche tries to communicate with you. Most people treat dreams as something secondary, a confusing sequence of images that disappears a few minutes after waking up. But Jung observed that during profound processes of psychological transformation, dreams change in nature. They become more intense, more organized, more symbolic, and above all, more difficult to ignore. It's as if an invisible intelligence has begun using the language of dreams to convey messages that the conscious mind cannot yet fully comprehend. For years, Jung recorded his own dreams and the dreams of thousands of patients. What he found was impressive. Often, the dreams seemed to know something the person didn't yet know about themselves. They revealed hidden conflicts, anticipated emotional crises, and, in some cases, pointed to transformations that would only become evident months or years later. But here, a troubling question arises. What if your dreams aren't just reacting to your life? What if they're trying to prepare you for something that hasn't happened yet? This possibility deeply fascinated Jung. He realized that some people reported dreams that seemed to anticipate future events, not in a vague or symbolic way, but through surprisingly specific images and situations. This did not mean, for Jung, that dreams were magical instruments of prediction. It meant that the psyche might be able to perceive invisible patterns before they fully manifested in conscious reality. Imagine someone repeatedly dreaming of a road disappearing before their eyes. A few weeks later, this person loses the job they believe to be permanent. Or someone who dreams several times of an old house collapsing and, shortly after, goes through the end of a relationship that sustained their entire emotional identity. Dreams don't create events, but he seems to perceive the internal movement that is leading him there. And this completely changes how we view the function of dreams. They cease to be mere reflections of the past and begin to act as bridges between what you consciously know and what is still emerging from the depths of the psyche. Now think of something curious. Why do some people have such vivid dreams that they can remember details for years, while others can barely recall a few seconds after waking up? Jung believed that this doesn't happen by chance. The closer a person gets to their individuation process, the more importance dreams tend to gain. It's as if the unconscious realizes that there is finally someone willing to listen. And when that happens, the symbols start appearing more frequently. A mountain, a forest, an ocean, a child, an old, wise man, a closed door, a key. To the average mind, they are just images. For Jung, these are expressions of profound forces that exist within the universal structure of the human psyche. He called these forces archetypes. Archetypes don't belong only to you. They belong to all of humanity. That's why they appear in different cultures, at different times, and in people who have never had contact with each other. And dreams are one of the most direct ways in which these archetypes come into contact with consciousness. But there's something even more surprising. Not all dreams have the same importance. Jung identified a special category that he called the great dreams. These dreams are not just intense. They possess an almost sacred quality. Those who experience them tend to describe them in the same way. Something seemed different. Something seemed bigger. Something seemed imbued with a presence impossible to explain. Often, a person wakes up with the feeling of having received an important message, even without immediately understanding its meaning. In other cases, she wakes up profoundly transformed, without any external event, without any conversation, without any rational explanation, simply transformed, as if something had been rearranged inside her overnight. And perhaps the most intriguing part is this: you don't control these dreams. They appear when they want to appear. They appear when the psyche determines that you are ready to receive them. This creates an interesting paradox. The more someone tries to force extraordinary experiences, the less likely they are to happen. But the more a person develops attentiveness, humility, and openness, the more depth their dreams seem to gain. Could this explain why so many important answers emerge precisely when we stop desperately searching for them? Jung believed so. He observed that the conscious mind has very clear limits. It analyzes, compares, organizes, and plans. But there is a much larger dimension operating beneath the surface, a dimension capable of connecting memories, emotions, symbols, and perceptions in ways that rational thought could never reproduce on its own. Dreams are one of the few windows to this territory, and that's precisely why they can be so uncomfortable. They don't always show what we want to see. They often reveal exactly what we are trying to avoid: an ignored fear, an old wound, a truth that conscience does not wish to admit. Jung said that what we don't consciously confront returns through the unconscious, and it often returns in the form of dreams. Perhaps that's why some people wake up disturbed after certain dreams, not because they saw something frightening, but because they encountered a part of themselves they had been avoiding for years. And here something fascinating happens. The more attention you pay to your dreams, the more they seem to respond. More symbols emerge, more connections are appearing, more meaning emerges, as if a silent conversation were beginning. A conversation between what you believe yourself to be and what actually is. But there is an unexpected consequence to this process. As dreams become deeper, the boundary between the inner world and the outer world begins to seem less rigid. Intuition skills are increasing. Perceptions become more accurate. Synchronicities intensify, and a new question begins to arise. Who is dreaming? It seems like a simple question, but it isn't. Because the more Jung investigated the psyche, the more he realized that the ego was not the only center of consciousness within the human being. There was something deeper, watching everything, something broader, something that seemed to exist beyond the ordinary personality. And it was precisely this discovery that led Jung to one of the most revolutionary conclusions of his entire career: the idea that you are not just who you think you are. And when this perception begins to emerge directly from experience, not just as theory, the entire structure of identity begins to transform in a way that few people are prepared to understand. There's a reason why so many people report that spiritual or psychological awakening becomes more intense precisely when they believe they are losing control of their own lives. Carl Jung noticed this pattern repeatedly. Men and women came to him convinced that something was wrong. They felt different, strangely self-aware, as if a part of the identity they had built over years was beginning to crumble. What scared them most wasn't the change itself. It was the feeling that they could no longer go back to being who they were before. Perhaps you know this feeling. You continue living your routine. You work, you talk to people, you keep your commitments. On the outside, almost nothing has changed, but inside, a silent transformation is taking place. You begin to observe your own thoughts in a different way. Reactions that once seemed automatic become visible. Emotions that once completely dominated your decisions are now perceived even before they take control. It's as if there's a second layer of consciousness observing the first. Jung dedicated a large part of his work to understanding this phenomenon, and his conclusion was radical for the time. The ego, what we normally call I, is not the center of the psyche. It is only a small part of it. This statement seems simple, but its implications are enormous. Most people spend their entire lives believing that they are their thoughts, their opinions, their fears, their desires, their memories. But what happens when you start to realize that something is watching all of this? Who is this observer? This question haunted Jung for decades. He realized that during profound processes of individuation, many people reported similar experiences. It didn't matter their culture, their religion, their profession. The pattern repeated itself. They were beginning to feel that they existed on two levels at the same time. At the first level was the average personality, The person who wakes up in the morning, pays bills, works, and faces life's challenges. On the second level, there was something much broader, a silent presence, a consciousness that seemed to observe life itself unfolding. Interestingly, modern research on mindfulness and metacognition has found results that align with this observation. Studies show that people trained to observe their own thoughts develop a significantly greater ability to regulate emotions, reduce impulsivity, and make more conscious decisions. But Jung went beyond neuroscience. For him, this was not just a mental skill. It was the beginning of a profound reorganization of identity. Imagine an actor who has spent his entire life believing he is the character he portrays. Then, suddenly, he realizes there is someone beyond the character, someone who is observing the entire play. This discovery is liberating, but it's also scary, because many of the certainties upon which we build our identity begin to lose their solidity. What you used to call personality starts to seem less permanent. What you once called absolute truth becomes relative. What you called destiny seems more flexible than you imagined. And here, an unexpected fact arises. Carl Jung observed that this process often generates resistance, not just external resistance, internal resistance. The ego doesn't like to lose its central position. In fact, he often reacts in extremely creative ways to regain control. One of the most common forms is what Jung called psychological inflation. The person has a profound experience of expanded consciousness and immediately transforms that experience into a special new identity. She begins to believe that she is superior, more evolved, more awake, more important than the others. But there is a problem. Whenever the ego tries to appropriate something greater than itself, life usually responds, and usually responds in a humiliating way. Jung observed this pattern numerous times. People who felt enlightened faced situations that revealed their weaknesses. People who believed they had transcended their fears discovered new, hidden fears. People who considered themselves free from the shadow discovered even deeper aspects of it. This did not happen as a punishment. It happened as a form of correction, as a natural balancing mechanism. Perhaps you've experienced something similar before. Perhaps you experienced a moment of extreme clarity and confidence, only to feel vulnerable again a few days later. Perhaps you believed you finally understood everything, and then life presented you with a new question. Jung saw this as a healthy sign, because true growth does not eliminate humanity. He deepens it. One of the most striking stories involving Jung occurred during the period when he wrote the famous Red Book. For years, he immersed himself in such intense inner experiences that many colleagues believed he was on the verge of madness. But Jung realized something extraordinary. He wasn't getting lost. I was learning to navigate between two worlds, the world of rational consciousness and the world of the symbolic depths of the psyche. And this ability would become one of the foundations of his entire psychology. Because the goal wasn't to destroy the ego, it was about putting it in its proper place. Think about that for a moment. Throughout your life, you may have been taught to strengthen your identity, to construct an image, developing a personality, define who you are. But Jung discovered that there is a huge difference between having a healthy ego and believing that you are only your ego. The first one brings stability. The second one brings limitations. And the more consciousness matures, the more evident this difference becomes. You are still you. It still has a history. He still has preferences. It still has objectives. But he is no longer completely bound to them. There is space. There is an observation. There is freedom. Perhaps that's why profoundly transformed people often exhibit a curious characteristic. They seem strong without needing to prove their strength, confident without needing to impress, safe without needing to dominate. Jung realized that this happens because identity ceases to depend exclusively on external approval. When someone experiences the self, that which they considered the organizing center of the psyche, a different kind of stability emerges, a stability that doesn't depend so much on circumstances. But this transformation creates an unexpected consequence. You start to see patterns that previously went unnoticed, not just within oneself, but also in the people around them. You notice repetitive behaviors, notice the social masks. He notices old conflicts being reproduced in new settings, and little by little, an even deeper understanding emerges. Perhaps life's events aren't as personal as they seem. Perhaps there is something greater at work through individual stories. Perhaps human dramas are connected to forces far older than we imagine. It was precisely this insight that led Carl Jung to one of his most fascinating discoveries: the idea that we are all living not only a personal life, but also a universal story that has been repeating itself for thousands of years through different faces, cultures, and eras. And when that understanding finally awakens, the whole of reality begins to reveal a layer of meaning that previously remained invisible. Imagine discovering that many of the most important events in your life didn't begin the moment they happened. Imagine realizing that they were already being prepared long before, in an invisible layer of your own psyche. This was one of Carl Jung's most profound conclusions. After decades of studying dreams, symbols, religions, mythologies, and thousands of human stories, he arrived at an extraordinary insight. Behind personal life lies a much larger story being lived through each individual. Most people believe their lives are made up of isolated events. A relationship begins, a job ends, a change happens, a crisis arises. Everything seems disconnected. Everything seems the result of random circumstances. But Jung began to notice something intriguing. People from different countries, cultures, and eras went through surprisingly similar experiences, not just in their behaviors, but in the profound meanings of their journeys. It was as if there were invisible patterns organizing human experience. That's how he deepened his study of archetypes. For Jung, archetypes are not imaginary characters. They are universal structures present in the collective unconscious. They are psychological forces that shape how we perceive the world, love, suffer, struggle, mature, and find meaning in existence. Perhaps you've never thought about it this way, but observe your own life. How many times have you had to face something that seemed bigger than your capabilities? How many times have you been forced to abandon an old version of yourself in order to become someone different? How many times have you gone through periods of darkness without knowing they were preparing a transformation? Jung realized that these experiences appear repeatedly because they are part of a narrative that is much older than any individual story. Imagine a child growing up admiring their parents. For years, they seem like almost perfect figures. Then comes a moment when the child begins to see their limitations. For the first time, they realize that those who seemed invincible also have fears, flaws, and weaknesses. For many people, this seems like just a natural phase of growing up. But Jung saw something more. He saw the archetype of the father and mother undergoing a transformation within the psyche. What seems like a personal experience is also a universal movement, and this happens continuously throughout life. A person loses a relationship they believed would last forever. Initially, everything seems like just suffering, but months later, they realize that the loss forced them to develop strengths they never would have discovered otherwise. Another individual faces a devastating professional crisis. For a while, they feel only fear and insecurity. However, that crisis ends up leading them down a path much more aligned with their true nature. The curious thing is that, when we look back, these events often seem to be part of a logical sequence, as if there were an intelligence organizing events, as if life knew where it was leading you, even when you didn't. It was precisely this phenomenon that fascinated Jung. He realized that many patients arrived at his office believing they were only experiencing isolated problems. But by analyzing their histories in depth, extremely clear archetypal patterns emerged. The hero facing an ordeal, the orphan seeking belonging, the warrior learning courage, the healer discovering his own wounds, the shadow demanding recognition, the great mother offering protection or imprisonment. These patterns don't belong to just one person. They belong to humanity. And the more one's consciousness awakens, the easier it becomes to recognize them. Perhaps that's why certain films, books, and stories move us so deeply, not because they are merely entertainment, but because they awaken something that already exists within us. When someone watches a hero's journey overcoming seemingly impossible obstacles, a deep part of their psyche recognizes that path. When we see someone fall, lose everything, and be reborn stronger, we feel there is truth in that story, because it reflects processes that happen within all of us. Jung believed that myths survived for thousands of years, precisely for this reason. They are not just stories. They are psychological maps. They are symbolic representations of the stages that human consciousness goes through during life. But there's something even more surprising. At a certain point during awakening, the person begins to perceive these patterns as they are happening, not just afterwards, during. She realizes she's going through a cycle. He recognizes that he is facing an initiation. It understands that an old identity is dying so that a new one can emerge. This does not eliminate the pain. It does not eliminate uncertainty, but it completely transforms the meaning of the experience. Imagine walking through a dark night, believing you are lost. Now, imagine going through that same night, knowing that it's part of a transformative journey. The external environment remains the same, but the internal experience changes completely. This is what Jung observed in people who progressed deeply in the individuation process. They were beginning to see purpose where before they had only seen suffering, not because they denied reality, but because they were able to see a deeper layer of it. And then an even more unusual realization emerges, the feeling that your life has a central theme, a kind of internal narrative that has been with you since childhood. Some people realize they've spent their lives learning about independence. Others realize that they have always been learning about trust. Some repeatedly face challenges related to belonging. Others are constantly led to develop courage. Jung called this a personal myth, the unique story that each soul is called to live. Not the story that society expects, not the story that the ego wants to construct, but the story emerges from the depths of the psyche itself. And the more aware someone becomes, the more they begin to recognize this pattern. Seemingly random events begin to connect. Past experiences take on new meanings. Past decisions reveal its importance. Everything is starting to seem like part of the same narrative. But perhaps the strangest experience of all is this one. You start to feel certain movements before they happen. Not because I'm predicting the future, but because it recognizes the internal signs that precede the changes. Jung observed this numerous times. People dreamed of journeys ahead before major changes. They dreamed of symbolic deaths before profound transformations. They dreamed of new paths before opportunities arose. The psyche seemed to know beforehand, as if it were a few steps ahead of consciousness. And when that understanding matures, something extraordinary happens. You stop seeing life as a random sequence of events. Begin to see it as a living process of developing consciousness. Each encounter, every loss, every achievement, every challenge, everything becomes part of a bigger story. A story that doesn't belong only to you, but to human evolution itself. And it was precisely this conclusion that led Carl Jung to his broader and bolder vision. The idea that individual awakening is not just a personal transformation. It's part of something much bigger, something that involves the future of human consciousness itself. And when he realized this, he understood that all previous experiences, the synchronicities, the dreams, the expansion of consciousness, the archetypes, and the personal myth were merely signs of an even deeper process that was silently unfolding within all of humanity. We've reached the point where all the pieces are starting to fall into place. Throughout this journey, inspired by the ideas of Carl Jung, we explore phenomena that many people experience, but rarely understand. We talk about synchronicities, about the ability to perceive hidden meanings in life's events. We discuss the transcendent function and the ability to sustain paradoxes without running away from them. We explore dreams as messages from the depths of the psyche. We investigate the transformation of identity through the encounter between the ego and the self. And finally, we understand that our life is not just a sequence of personal events, but part of a much larger drama, connected to archetypes and the collective unconscious. But now comes the most important question of all. What should we do with this knowledge? Because knowledge without transformation becomes merely intellectual entertainment. Jung never intended to create a psychology to be admired from afar. His goal was to help human beings become more self-aware. The truth is that many people spend years accumulating information about spirituality, psychology, and self-knowledge without allowing anything to truly change within themselves. They read books, they watch videos, they listen to lectures, but they continue to live in exactly the same way. Carl Jung believed that true transformation begins when an idea ceases to be merely a mental understanding and becomes a conscious experience. Therefore, I want to share a simple plan that is deeply aligned with everything we've seen so far, not like a magic formula, but as a practical way to begin applying these teachings in real life. The first step is to develop observation skills. For the next few days, stop trying to control everything that happens around you. Instead, observe. Observe your thoughts. Pay attention to your emotions. Observe the patterns that repeat themselves. Pay attention to events that seem to carry significance. Just observe. No rush to interpret. No need to be anxious to find immediate answers. Jung said that what we consciously observe loses some of the power it unconsciously exerted over us. The second step is to record your experiences. Keep a notebook. Write down your dreams. Write down your intuitions. Note down striking coincidences. Write down recurring emotions. You'll be surprised to realize how many connections begin to emerge when you look at your own life closely. Many people believe that they have no signs, synchronicities, or inner messages. Most of the time, they're just not paying attention. The third step is to ask a simple question whenever you encounter a difficulty. Don't just ask, "Why is this happening to me?" Ask, "What is this trying to teach me?" This small change completely alters how you relate to challenges. The victim is looking for someone to blame. Consciousness seeks meaning, and it is often in this sense that growth begins to emerge. The fourth step is to establish a dialogue with one's own shadow. This is perhaps the most difficult part. When you feel intense irritation towards someone, ask yourself what that person is reflecting about you. When you feel envious, investigate what it's revealing about forgotten desires. When you feel afraid, ask yourself which part of yourself is trying to protect it. Jung believed that the shadow is not an enemy. She is an abandoned part of our own totality. And the more we reject it, the more power it gains. The fifth step is to create moments of silence. We live in a time where almost every minute is filled with distractions. Videos, messages, notifications, noises, but the self speaks softly, very low, and often their voice can only be heard when the noise subsides. Set aside a few minutes each day to be quiet, without objectives, no complicated techniques needed, no expectations, just being there. Over time, you will begin to notice thoughts, insights, and perceptions that previously went unnoticed. The sixth step is to accept uncertainty. Perhaps this is one of Jung's greatest lessons. The mind craves assurances. He wants definitive answers. He wants control. But the individuation process requires courage to walk even when the path is not yet fully illuminated. You don't need to understand everything right now. You don't need to have all the answers. You just need to keep moving forward honestly, because true transformation rarely happens through sudden, grand revelations. It happens through small, conscious choices repeated over time. And perhaps Carl Jung's greatest discovery was precisely that. You are not here to become someone else. You are here to become who you truly are. There is a huge difference between these two things. The first one seeks approval. The second search is for authenticity. The first one tries to build a better mask. The second one removes the masks. The first search is to fit in. The second one seeks to integrate. And when this integration happens, something extraordinary emerges. You stop constantly fighting against yourself. You stop running away from your own shadows. You stop desperately seeking external validation, and a much deeper trust begins to develop. The confidence of someone who knows they don't need to be perfect to keep evolving. Perhaps that's precisely why so many people describe awakening not as an achievement, but as a return. A return to what has always been present. A return to one's own essence. A return to what Jung called the self. If you've made it this far, I want you to remember something important. It doesn't matter what stage of the journey you're in, no matter how many doubts still exist, no matter how many challenges are still ahead of you, the simple act of seeking to understand one's own consciousness already places one on a path that many people will never have the courage to travel. Keep watching, keep learning, keep asking questions, keep looking inside. Because, as Carl Jung understood, he who looks outside dreams, but he who looks inside awakens. And perhaps awakening is not the end of the journey. Perhaps this is just the beginning of the most authentic life you can live. If you found this video valuable, subscribe to the channel to follow future content about Carl Jung, depth psychology, consciousness, and inner development. Leave a like so that this content reaches more people who are also going through similar experiences, and share in the comments which of the experiences presented in this video caught your attention the most. If you prefer, you can comment anonymously or without going into personal details. Your experience can help others realize they are not alone on their journey. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next video.